Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be continuing development of our web application, incorporating what we learned in our last lesson about how to access a MySQL database from PHP. Before we go into the specifics of what we change about our web application in our new version, which is going to be 14.0, we're going to introduce a function called sprintf, which is a function that's built into PHP. That makes it easier to, you'll find it easier to write insert statements using this function. So we're going to talk about how the function works, talk about how to use it in insert statements, and then we're going to go over the changes that we've made to this web application in version 14.0. And specifically what we've done is we just updated a small part of our web application. We've updated the admin page, additem.php, so that when we add an item to our web store, instead of adding it to items.txt, it's now going to add it to our database. So our application isn't going to be fully functional anymore, in that it's going to have some different parts to it. It'll be reading from items.txt, but we'll be inserting items into the database. And what we're going to gradually do over the next few web application lessons is basically eliminate all of the the flat file database that we have, and convert it all over to the MySQL database backend. And while we do that, there's going to be some overlapping parts where some things are in files and some things are in the database. So the sprintf function is basically, it's used to do what is known as generating formatted strings. And basically what it does is it takes what it calls a formatted string. I think a better name for it is a string template. You basically define a template for a string, and then you call this sprint function. You pass it this string template and then values that you want inserted into that template. So for example, and the way that you, well, let's just look at the example. I think that's easiest. Let's say that we want to write my name is Joe, and so we have a variable called Joe, and we have a variable called first, and it has the value Joe. Well, we can create a formatted string or a string template that will be used by this sprintf function, and this is what the template looks like. It's a normal string containing string data, but then it has this special sort of modifier in here, %, followed by an s, which says that that when you use this string with the sprintf function, it's going to replace that %s with a string variable that you also provide to the method. There's other things you can do. You can include float information. You can include all different data types. Typically what you use it for is to include strings information. We're going to see that's going to be useful in the insert statement, because we need to include multiple string variables within a string, within a query string. So for example, we call sprintf. We pass it this format. So let me erase this so you can see it better. And actually, I don't know why this is still here. This is a typo. We're only passing it two parameters. We're passing it the format string and then first. And basically what this does is sprintf, it goes through this format string, and it outputs a string, and any regular string data that it finds, it simply adds to the string that it's generating. And then anytime it comes upon, for example, a %s, the first time it reaches it, it replaces that with the value provided as the first parameter to this sprintf function. So sprintf takes a variable number of arguments. So for example, we actually could change this. So let's say this wasn't here, and we had another $s in this formatted string. And let's say actually the way I'd actually originally intended to write this, we call sprintf. We pass it this format string here that's going to be looking for two string variables to insert, and then we're going to pass it two variables, first and last. So let's say up here if we were to insert another variable declaration, last name Smith. So now what we do is when sprintf is called, it generates a string. It goes through this format string, adds to the string it's generating any regular string data, any regular character data. The first %s it finds, it replaces with the value of the first parameter. In this case, it's a variable called first. And then the second one, it encounters the %s. It's going to replace it with what's passed in as the second parameter to the sprintf function. And you can do this and so on for as many variables as you want to include in this particular string. What it's going to do is going to end up generating the string. So at the end of this, str for this particular example is going to end up being the string, my name is Joe Smith. So that's how the sprintf function works. Well, let's take a look at now why we're actually introducing this function, because it's commonly used to generate insert queries when working with databases. As we know, when we have insert queries, we're inserting. We have a query that says insert into a table name, and then values, and then we have a in parentheses we have a comma delimited list of a number of different values that we're trying to insert into the database. For example, for our item table, we include a null value for the item ID. We include a string that's for the name. We include a number for the price, and then 2 strings for the description and the image file extension. Well, if you want to include that all into one string in PHP, let's say you used, for example, double quoted strings, and let's say you had some variables. For example, when we're going to be actually using our insert statement, we're actually going to be accessing, we're going to be building our insert statement by pulling information about an item from an item object. So if we wanted to build up a string or an insert query, let's say we had insert into items values. Let me continue this on the next line down here. And then we would write null. And then for the name, we would use our curly brace notation. Let's say we had an item object called item. We would do name. And we would add the price. And actually this would be surrounded by single quotes. And so on. And so you get this really ugly looking string. So what we can do, I'm going to erase this now, is to simplify this is to use the sprintf function. So for example, let's say we have a database called people, which we learned about in one of our homework problems, that has 2 fields that we're going to be inserting, name and age. And so let's say we have a variable called name that's set to the value Joe Smith. We have an age variable that's set to 40. Well, in order to, basically what we can do is we can use this sprintf function to generate this insert statement by creating a string template, a string format that has the string data insert into people, space values, and then it uses these %s symbols that we learned about that the sprint function is going to sprintf function is going to be able to insert values in place of. Now, because our name Joe Smith in our database is actually a string, it's a varchar, notice that we have to include single quotes here. And actually this should be included in double quotes because we have single quotes. So make sure that when you generate these insert statements you have appropriately quoted string variables. Age is going to be an integer, so we actually don't include that. One thing to note is that SQL statements are always just strings. When we have an SQL insert statement, it's just a string of characters. And now it may contain string data, it may contain number data. The way we denote string data is by putting it within quotation marks. But essentially, when you create a SQL statement, it's all going to be a string. So that's why here, even though we might be including an age, which is an integer, we're still going to use the %s value, because what it's going to do is it's going to convert that age integer into a string to add to this built-up insert into query. So now we're going to create a variable called query. Basically, we're going to call sprintf on this format that we generated up here. And then we're going to pass it the values first. Well, looks like I didn't update the example. We're going to pass it the values name, the variables name and age. And what that's going to do is that's going to, when it reaches this, when it's basically generating the string and it reaches this first %s, it's going to insert the value of the variable name. When it reaches the second %s, it's going to input or insert the value, the string value of the variable age. And the reason age goes second and name goes first is just the order that they're specified within this sprintf function. So now that we've talked about that, that sort of gives us a background for what we're going to see in the details of this new version, which is version 14.0. We're going to talk about the changes that we made. The first thing that we did was we updated the logger class to include a log debug static method, which basically is going to be used to debug message to log debug messages. And this is something that you most likely will find useful, and I've included it because it's sort of it's a commonly used coding practice to help debug your code. Basically, what we can do is include statements, log debug function calls throughout our code to basically keep track of things as they go along to make sure things are working. For example, we can have a debug statement that will say, okay, we've successfully connected to the database. Okay, we're running this query. Okay, we're going to close, we've successfully closed the database, and so forth. So if we go and look at this new class we have, logger, what we can see is there's just a new message log debug, new method log debug. It's a static method, and it's the same as the error and warning messages, except we prepend any debug statements with just this sort of debug flag, which is just debug in all capital letters. And so this is just a method we're going to be able to use to help us in debugging our code, and hopefully you'll find it a useful technique. So besides the logger class, which is sort of a secondary not the most important part of this web application lesson, is we've created a class called Database Access. And basically what that's going to do is, in our last lesson we learned how to interact with the MySQL database from PHP. It has those 4 steps. Connect to the database, run a query, process the results, close the connection. Well, these are common. We're going to be running multiple queries, inserts, selects, updates, deletes throughout our web application. And all of these have the common function in that they will be opening a connection to the database and closing a connection to the database. So anytime we have things that would be used over and over again, we want to take advantage of code reuse. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to create this database access object that's going to encapsulate any queries that we're going to be running. For example, a get items query to load all the items from the database. This database access class is going to encapsulate all of those interactions. And basically what it does is it has a constructor that is going to, when it's called, it's actually going to set up a MySQLi. It's going to create a MySQLi instance, which is going to represent, as we learned, a connection to our database. And then in the destructor, it's actually going to call the close method so that every time we're done using the class, it always closes our connection to the database. So if we actually go and take a look at this new class in version 14.0, it's called Database Access. Now let's look at the source code for it. We can see that it has, blow this up a little bit, it has a private property that we're just calling DB, and what that's going to do is that's going to represent, it's going to be a MySQLi object instance, which represents a PHP connection to our MySQL database. And then basically what we have is we have a constructor here. And our constructor serves to, when we create a database access object, it serves to go ahead and create that connection to the database and store it in this DB property that we have. So basically what we're saying is store in the DB property of this class a new MySQLi instance, and it's going to create it using these constants that we've created. And actually we've created a new file, a new configuration file for this particular version of the web application called dbconfig.php, and basically it contains these 4 constants. Let's look at the source code. That defines the host name of our database we're connecting to, the username we want to connect as, PHP user, our password, and then also the name of the database that we want to define, that we want to use. So we basically have this new dbconfig file, and we've simply included it within our regular config file. And we just separated it out to sort of separate commonly related constants in a separate file. If we go back to database access, we can see that what it does is it uses these constants to create a new MySQLi object, which is a connection to a MySQL database. We store it in this private class property DB. And then basically we perform what we learned about in the last lesson, was we perform some error checking on whether the connection was successfully made or not. So we, in this case, we're checking for an error message. We're accessing the MySQLi object, which is the DB property of this class, and then we're accessing the connect error property of that, which is going to be an error message. If it's not empty, that means that an error has occurred, so we test to see if it's not empty. If it's not empty, then what we're going to do is throw an exception that basically says there's an error connecting to the database, and it outputs the contents of that error message. If everything was okay, then we're going to make use of our log debugs function that we had just talked about. Basically just logging a note to ourselves in our log file that says you've successfully connected to the database. Now these log debug statements are something that you typically use in the development stage of your application. In a real application you wouldn't want to include these. I've included them here because we're developing an application and it's a useful application development tool to just sort of demonstrate that. But in a production environment you actually wouldn't include these log debug statements, because then you're having all these, for example, these are writing to a data file on your server, so every time you have file I/O it makes things go slower, so that's why you wouldn't have these in a production server. So I just wanted to mention that. We have a destructor for this class, and basically what that does is that takes responsibility for closing the connection that is open to the MySQL database that this class represents. So what it does is it calls the close method on our MySQLi object stored in the DB property variable of this particular class, and then we get the value that was returned, whether it was true or false. And if there's an error closing the connection, we're not going to throw an exception, but we are going to log a warning message using the log warning static method of our logger class, and just saying there was an error closing a connection to the database. That'll at least give us some information. If we're having problems with our application, we can look at the log and see what's going on. And then if it's successfully closed, we're adding just another debug statement that says you've successfully closed a connection to the database. So the other method that we've included in this is called insert item, and that's for inserting an item into the database. So when a user goes to, when a user goes to additem.php in our admin site and it enters a name, price, description, and image file, and it clicks add item, whereas before we would be adding the item information to our items.txt file, we're now going to be inserting that item information into our items table of our advanced PHP database. So basically, this insert item function is going to take an item object, and then what it's going to do is from that item object it's going to build up an insert query to insert that into the database. The item object will have everything except for it's not going to have the item ID, because that's automatically generated when we insert it into the table. So we're going to build up our insert query using this sprintf function we just learned about. So we're saying, and I hope this is dark enough that you can see, we're going to say insert into items table the values, and then we have 5 parameters that we're going to be filling in with our sprintf function. Notice that the name parameter, which is the second parameter, or the second column in our table, is enclosed in quotes, as well as the last two, which are the description and the image file exception, because those are strings. The first one, which is just going to be a null value, is left as just a string without quotes, because it's not going to be quoted. It just is the NULL is all that's provided to MySQL. And then our price, since it's a number, it's not a string, it's not enclosed in quotation marks. We just have %s without single quotes around it. Then we go ahead and generate the query. We pass it this string template. For the first %s, we pass it the string null, so it's just going to include NULL within this string without quotation marks around it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass it the name of the item, the price, the description, and the image file extension, all that were entered by the user on our particular form. Then something that I commonly do when working with database applications is I make a debug statement, or add a debug statement to the log file that notes the query that I'm running. So I'm simply basically outputting this query message, or logging this, I'm logging the query, this insert query that we just created, to our log file. That way, if we're having problems with a query and we're trying to figure out why isn't an item being inserted into the database, if we look at our log file, we can see the query that was actually generated that was passed to MySQL to be run, and therefore maybe we can see the errors in, maybe it's an error in the query. For example, maybe we left out a single quote or something like that. So we log the query, use the query method of our MySQL class to run the query, which is step 2 in our process. Step 3 is to process the results. We're going to get the number of affected rows and store it in a numRows variable. We're going to get the insert ID for the row that was inserted because it has an auto increment column, and it's going to generate a new item ID. We're going to call it insert ID. And then we're going to basically test that the item was properly inserted into the database. And the way we're going to check that is that we're going to make sure that the number of rows was equal to 1, that only one row was inserted. And then also we're going to check that the insert ID is not equal to the value 0. And one thing to note is that the insert ID property, if you insert a row into a database and there's an error doing it, insert ID will get set to 0, which is why we test here for its 0. So if either of these error conditions occur, we're going to throw an exception, say there was an error inserting an item into the database. Assuming those error conditions don't occur, what we're going to do is we're going to update that item object that was passed into this particular function by setting its item ID equal to the insert ID that was generated for it. So now we have this item object that's built up and has all of its properties. It has its name, its price, its description, and image file extension, and now it also has its item ID set, and we're going to return that item object. And what we're going to find out is that our script that calls this insert item function is going to be able to use that to output information. For example, on addItem.php, when we add an item, it outputs the ID that was generated for a particular item. So basically, we mentioned the update to dbconfig, or the creation of dbconfig, but also we've updated addItem.php. So let's take a look at the changes that we've made there. In our addItem.php before, basically what we did was we would validate an item. We would build up an item from the excuse me, from the information submitted on the add item form, and then we validate the items, the information submitted, the image data, and then also the data provided, the name, the description, so forth. And then what we did was we added the item to our flat file database using the insert item function. And what we would do is we would pass it this item object that we had built up, and then we would pass it the image data, which was is something that, as we learned in our lesson on uploading files, is contained in this file superglobal array. And then what insert item would do is it would basically it would look up the last ID for the last item added to the database in last_added.txt. It would create a new row in our items table, or in our items.txt file, that would represent this new item. It would update that last item, the last added file with the ID of the new item that was generated, and then when it go ahead, it would move the uploaded image to the appropriate spot on the server. Well, in our new addItem.php, we're not going to be making use of items.txt anymore. We're not going to be doing those file operations. So what we're actually going to do is we still create this item object. We build it up from information provided on the form. We validate the information provided just as before. One thing we do this time is, because we're going to be passing this item object to our database access class object method insert item that we just talked about, we want to have all the information populated except for the item ID. So we're actually going to set the image file extension on this item object, and the way we do that is we're going to make use of this getFileExtension method that we define in our util_lib library, and that's going to set the file extension for this particular item. And then here's the key part: is we're creating our new instance of our database access class that we just discussed. And basically, as we saw, what that does is when you call this constructor, it creates a MySQLi object, which creates a connection to our database. Then we simply call on this, and we're calling it the variable DBA for database access. Then we're simply calling the insert item method in this particular class instance, and we pass it this new item object variable, which is this item object that we've been building up from the form data and from the image data. And then what that's going to return is an item object that's been updated with the insert ID. So what we can actually do is, now that we have this fully updated item return, we can access the item ID that was generated, and we can set that as our new item ID, which is a variable that we used in the script previously to output, for example, at the bottom of the script. We would output the new item ID and said, if the item was successfully added, we would output this new item ID. So we simply set that variable new item ID equal to this. If new item ID is equal to 0, if it's which would indicate an error, we're going to throw an exception. And if not, then what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and move the image that the user uploaded to the appropriate spot on the web server. And so basically what we've done is all of this functionality before was included in the insert item function that we had in filelib.php. So if we look at our last version of our web application, and we look at the insert item function, we can see that it did a number of different things. It would load the ID of the last item added. It would update the item object with this new item. It would update the image file extension of the item. And these are all things that we just saw have been moved to additem.php. It would go ahead and it would move the uploaded image. And then it would go ahead and basically insert the item into the database, which is our items.txt file, and then update the last item added, the last added text file with the new ID. So basically what we've done is we've eliminated this function, and we've taken all the functionality. Basically, the part of this was not only updating the database with the items ID, but also moving the image, and we've just moved that all into the beginning of the additem.php script. So actually what we've done in our new version of our web application is we've gotten rid of a lot of functions, or a couple of functions within our file library. For example, we no longer need the insert item function. Because we are generating the ID for the new item not by looking up the last added file, the ID in the last added.txt file, it's being generated by MySQL. We can get rid of this get last item added function, and we can also get rid of the update last item added function because that's all going to be handled by the database now. So if we actually go and look at, this is our new version of the admin page, version 14.0. And let me go ahead and log into our MySQL server using MySQL Monitor. And let's take a look at the items that are currently in the database. Our six default items are in the database right now. And if we go ahead and run this new form, let's say we call it new item. We're going to call it 1499. We're just going to say description for the description. We're going to set its image equal to basketball. And then what we're going to do, I was just checking to make sure that something was set up right. And then when we click on add item, now instead of adding it to items.txt, it's going to add it to our database. So we click add item. It's going to say the item was successfully added to the store. The item ID is 1007, which makes sense because the last ID of our item in our store was 1006. And so if we actually go and rerun this select statement, we can see that this new item has been added to the store, in fact, and it's been given the ID 1007. So we can see that this is how our new add item form works. Now the other thing, also we should note that just to verify that in images we can see that we selected a basketball, that item 1007.jpg has been added, and it's a basketball image. The other thing is, let's take a look at the log files. We had talked about adding these log debug statements to see what it actually looks like. So if we click on the logs directory in the version 14.0, we click on log.txt, blow this up, we can see these debug statements. We can see there's a statement that says successfully connected to the database. We can see a debug statement that outputs the query that we ran, which was insert into items these values here. And that's the query that we ran, so we can verify if there was an error that that was what we tried to run. And then we can see that we successfully closed the connection to the database. It makes sense that these appear in this order because you open the database first, you run the query second, and then you close the database after that's all done. So this shows this was occurred when we ran the constructor for our database access class, and then when the script ends, our destructor is called on that database access object, which is going to close the connection to the database, and so we can see our debug message that's saying it was successfully closed. So you can see these debug statements can be useful, and you can add them wherever you need to throughout your code to provide whatever information you want to help you try and figure out what's going on with your particular application. And then this last bullet point was just about removing the functions from file.lib.php that were related to inserting an item to the database. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.